guys, welcome to your first genetics lesson. We're going to be covering topics 3.1 and 3.2. So just as a little intro, genetics is the study of inheritance and variation in inherited characteristics. It's all controlled by DNA, of course, which is contained in the chromosomes, and so actually the chromosomes that we inherit are a big part of our genetics. The chromosomes hold coded instructions, and keep in mind that DNA really what it does is codes for a number of proteins, and so proteins within the organism control the outcomes of what's called the phenotype for that organism. The phenotype is the specific characteristics of an organism, while the genotype is the specific genes that an organism possesses. Genes can be involved in a lot of different things, including the control of cellular activity and carrying out instructions for future generations. So genes are quite powerful, very important. They are very well protected inside the cell, inside the nuclear envelope, and we're going to learn a little bit more about them. So before we dive in, I want you guys to read your understandings 3.1.1 to 3.1.5 and get your bearings, find out what we're going to be learning about in this video. And then I want you to think and brainstorm what is a gene. And based on the image that's given above here, I want you to think about what is an allele, because understanding the difference between a gene and then the subcategory of allele is going to be really important in today's lesson. Alright, so a gene is a heritable factor, meaning it can be passed from one organism to another, that influences specific characteristics and occupies a particular locus. Alright, so locus is going to be an important term that we continue to hear, and locus is basically the location of a particular gene on a particular chromosome. So for example, in a species, the gene for having a widow's peak or not is always in the same locus. It's always on the same chromosome with the same location. It could have variation, of course, having a widow's peak or not, but the location is going to remain the same, which is huge in heritability because it allows for these particular genes to have different variations and to be expressed. So all individuals of a species carry the same genes at the same loci and on the same chromosome. So then each organism is unique because of the small base variations within the genes. And remember, the bases are our nucleotide bases that we've talked about: adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. So just small changes in bases at the same locus are going to result in huge variation within a species. So then an allele is one specific form of a gene. It's differing from the other alleles, like I said, only by one or a few bases, and occupies the exact same gene locus as the other alleles of that gene. So a lot of genes have many different alleles or many variations within the alleles. For example, for body height, tall is kind of general, and there could be a lot of variations between what we might call quote-unquote short or tall. Even hair color, red versus brown, there's a lot of variations even between that. So hair color is going to always be on the same locus, and it could have a number, or does have a number of different alleles, a number of different variations that could be expressed. These are just some kind of simplified examples, because things such as hair color and eye color and skin color are actually controlled by more than one gene. So saying that there's one definite color is kind of incorrect. But there are some simple genes, for example, like widow's peak like I used before, or having attached or detached earlobes, we think that those are controlled by individual genes and have a limited number of alleles. So we'll be using some of those simple examples in our practice. So one way that we get some variation in our genes is through mutation. And a mutation is a change in the amount chemical structure of DNA, which results in the alteration or non-production of a protein. So, for example, there could be a change in the DNA that does not technically lead to a mutation because it doesn't affect the DNA or the protein that's being coded for. For example, if a change in the DNA happens in an intron or something that doesn't code for anything, then that change won't necessarily have an impact on the organism, but a mutation is going to be a change that will result in something. So mutations can happen in two different categories. We can have somatic mutations or germline mutations. Somatic mutations are mutations that happen in an adult cell and impact the organism in which they've occurred. Okay, so that would be, for example, like for me, if I had a mutation in a skin cell or something, that could have an effect on me. It could potentially lead to a tumor or something like that, but it would be isolated in its effect to my person. A germline mutation, on the other hand, is going to be a mutation within sperm or egg, and so it actually likely won't affect the individual in which it occurred, but does have the potential, of course, to affect offspring and future generations. So germline mutations have, in a lot of ways, a lot larger or higher consequence because they're going to be passed on, and because when they are passed on, that mutation will be present in every cell of the newly formed organism. So a germline mutation is quite serious and often leads in a non-viable offspring. So when it comes to mutations, there's also two variations. The first is a gene mutation. The second is a chromosomal mutation, and we're actually going to save that and talk about that a little bit later. But a gene mutation is a mutation within the sequence of bases on the DNA of the gene. So that's where, an A gets swapped for a G or something like that. They are pretty rare because DNA polymerase is going to be always double checking as it replicates DNA to make sure that the bases are correct. So gene mutations are actually fairly rare, and like I said, they can have big consequences, but we don't see them as often as chromosomal mutations. One example of a gene mutation is sickle cell anemia. So this was caused by a base substitution that in turn impacts the mRNA that's produced from the DNA. And of course, that in turn will affect the final product, the final polypeptide or protein that's produced. And in this case, it impacts specifically hemoglobin. So here's what normal hemoglobin looks like, and here's what hemoglobin looks like in the cell of someone with sickle cell anemia. So you can see there's a profound difference in the structure of that polypeptide. So basically what's going on here is the hemoglobin structure has changed, and therefore the capacity to carry oxygen has changed. And so because people aren't able to carry oxygen efficiently, sickle cell anemia is deadly in those who have that gene. So this is kind of an interesting thing because it is heritable, so it's going to occur in germ cells, and it's deadly, so that would lead you to think that it would kind of cycle itself out, that natural selection would take care of it, that people who have sickle cell anemia would likely not live to reproduce, which is somewhat true. However, this has a really interesting story in that people who live in malaria-laden areas of the world actually increase their chance of survival if they have the sickle cell anemia gene from one parent. Okay, so here's normal blood. We've got all these normally shaped cells, and here would be the blood of someone who inherited sickle cell anemia from one parent. So they're said to be heterogeneous, meaning that they have one normal blood cell gene and one sickle cell blood gene. So it actually gives them a mixture. Okay, so people who have this mixing of normal and sickle cell blood cells are more capable of surviving malaria. And therefore, the sickle cell gene is actually selected for. And so they're given a competitive advantage. And it's really interesting because people who are heterogeneous are given a competitive advantage. People who are homogeneous or have only sickle cell blood cells, then they are likely going to die at a young age. So it's a really interesting story where a disease is being selected for because of another disease. And so we have seen sickle cell anemia continue to persist in populations where malaria is prevalent. So we're going to talk more about this in class, but please write down any questions that you have and have a great day. Thanks.